again today, I told Christina. She was trying hard to make me feel heard, yet I couldn't shake off the idea that she was simply waiting for the session time to end so she could move on to her next patient. Her eyes were locked on mine, but her gaze didn't convey it. It was empty, and try as I might, I couldn't tell if it was simple disinterest or if it was a reflection of my own imprint. "What was it that you dreamed, Gonzalo?" she answered, trying to express a seriousness she considered pertinent. "I was in my old house with Enrique, playing in the yard, just like we did when we were kids. Even looking like this, we were both laughing, but our faces expressed sadness. I felt happy playing with my best friend, but tears kept running down my cheek, as warm as if it were real life. The feeling was bittersweet." Christina could hear me, but I couldn't really convince myself that she was really interested in what I was telling her. However, I immediately knew that what followed would hold her interest. "Then the dream had a time skip," I continued. "From one moment to the next, I was in my house, just as I had been that day." As I suspected, with that sentence I could feel genuine attention from Christina. Of the 5 sessions I had with her, this was the first one in which I mentioned the events despite her previous and rather unsubtle instigation. I heard someone knocking at the door at an inconsistent pace, and although I asked several times who it was, I didn't know until I opened it myself. Behind the entrance stood Enrique, his face pale, his eyes glassy and lost, staring at me as if there was nothing more urgent than that instant. I didn't know what to do but ask him what was wrong. I tried to shake his shoulder, but the second my hands came near him, they felt numb, as if it hadn't been a dream. However, he only uttered, "Take it," in a weak voice almost like a whisper. He slowly brought his outstretched palm to me. There was a wisp of light. It was so intense that my entire field of vision went blank, and that's all I can remember. When I go over that day in my mind, whether asleep or awake, it's always different, and it never feels real. "Do you often think about that moment?" Christina asked in a nervous voice, which she was trying hard to conceal. "Well, since it happened, there's not a minute that goes by that I'm not thinking about it. And since the memory varies constantly, I feel I will never know what it was really like. I only have images in my head from there to when my mom found us, and I'm not sure how much time had passed after Enrique." I couldn't finish the sentence. "Don't worry, Gonzalo. We can leave the session until here. After Enrique died, I couldn't get the sclera of his eyes out of my mind, and as if he no longer had irises or pupils convulsing so uncontrollably that his head split because of the intensity with which he was beating himself against the floor. Gonzalo, please, let's take a break. I've never felt so helpless. I always think I could have done something to avoid what happened to him." "No, Gonzalo. Enrique's sudden death was due to an epileptic seizure. There's absolutely nothing that I could have called someone," I added, interrupting her. "I could have tried to calm him down, but I did nothing. Your mother told me everything, Gonzalo. They found you in a catatonic state. Please understand that you were unable to react." Christina continued talking for a while, but no matter how hard she tried to convince me, I will never stop the feeling that I was not there for Enrique when he needed me. While I don't consider myself a perspective person, when I noticed that she was getting overwhelmed, she was driven by the desperation of feeling like she was losing control. But I don't think I can blame her too much either, as this was the only session where I said more than a few uncommunicative sentences. She probably found it overwhelming that I behaved so explosively on the one occasion I didn't keep to myself. Maybe I overdid it. She asked me about the wisp of light I described to her in that dream. I replied that sometimes I remember it as a kind of blue-colored gem, sometimes as a simple stone, and sometimes it's even simply is Enrique's empty hand, but full of open wounds and an advanced state of decomposition. When it was finally time to leave, I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for the woman who looked distinctly unsettled. Not only because of the unease of my description, but also because she most likely realized that she had revealed information that she regretted afterward. At one point, near the end, she even came close to telling me that Enrique is not the only person who had died from an epileptic seizure in recent months, but that a number of similar cases had been reported in different parts of the world. I found out the day after it happened, and since then I had perceived the forced attempt on the parts of all those around me not to let me know about it. Perhaps it was not disinterest that I sensed in Christina's side during the conversation, but a deep concern on her part. The whole walk back to the house felt like a blank space in the daze, as if during those minutes I didn't care about anything but continued to move my leg. Maybe that was my progress. My mom was waiting for me in the front of the room of the house. Her dark circles under her eyes revealed a lack of sleep that she struggled to hide from me. When I hugged her as I greeted her, I smelled a strong cigarette smell in her hair, which was absolutely unprecedented, at least for as long as I can remember. On the coffee table were several reddened circular marks which had not been cleaned in weeks, as well as two wine glasses, one half full and the other empty, stained purple on the bottom. I answered the question she asked me about regarding therapy without much interest in even looking at her, and being careful not to reveal too much. However, I felt comfortable enough with her to take the next step. "Mom, I think I'm ready." She was silent for a couple of seconds as if she didn't understand what I was talking about. "I don't think it's necessary for you to keep Enrique's things in storage anymore," I continued. What I said surprised her. I wish I had found a more appropriate way to ask her, and although she tried to dissuade me at first, sooner rather than later, she agreed. She left for a few minutes and returned with a box that, even if I had known where it was kept, I would not dare to open until today. Inside, I found mostly photos, so many that it was almost possible to witness about 14 years of both of us growing up. Seeing them brought pressure to my chest and a constricting feeling in my throat. It was definitely not easy, but I knew it was necessary for the process I had already decided to overcome. After a while, after I had calmed down, I looked what was at the very bottom of the box. Nothing too relevant except for one object. At first glance, which caused some uncomfortable images to resurface all at once, it was a USB flash drive, or pendrive, as they usually call those with the particular design. Its blue color was the key to my realization that it was what Enrique had in his hand the day that he died, since in several of my recurring dreams, he was holding items of the same color. If it belonged to him, it was natural to think it contained personal files, but if he wanted to give it to me, it would probably be the perfect way to continue my attempt to have a peaceful life again. I turned on my old desktop computer, which was slightly dusty, and after waiting a couple of minutes, I plugged in the USB. The first thing that appeared inside the removable disk was a single folder with a name I couldn't decipher. The font was something similar to Cyrillic, but with characters that I could not recognize. I even thought the file was corrupted, which sent a little shiver down my spine. I thought it would be one of Enrique's witticism. After all, it would not be so strange. But it also crossed my mind that it could be malware, but I doubted very much that those had been his intentions. When he gave me the device, I opened the folder, and inside, I found another file with a generic icon named Sonic the Hedgehog.exe. And even though the name was misspelled, I immediately thought of the Sega character, the same one whose games were part of our precious moment I spent with Enrique several years ago, taking turns every single time we lost a life. It gave me so much joy that a smile almost broke out of my face. The EXE extension suggested that it was an emulated version of the Sega Genesis original, or maybe it would be something completely new, which didn't seem unusual coming from Enrique, who was fond of venturing into all sorts of new ways to satiate his characteristic curiosity. When I tried to start the executable, an error message was displayed. However, nothing written there was legible, but rather it seemed to have the same type of typography as the folder that contained it, although I had no way of knowing what the problem was. The only suspicious I could imagine was the name as such, which was apparently altered, most likely by accident. I corrected it to Sonic the Hedgehog.exe, and immediately the icon changed to the blue hedgehog silhouette, so my guesses were correct. Somehow, it was configured to only work with that specific name, but did Enrique change it on purpose to make it a little harder for me to open? Or maybe it was a joke. It could even be that the pen drive had some script that made the word change every time it was connected, but did he have the knowledge to achieve that? Then came the moment where all these questions began to overwhelm me. This was not what I expected to reminisce about past happy times, so I simply decided to double click and forget about the pain for a good while. The screen went black, and a few seconds later at the bottom right, a text appeared that read loading, with three ellipsis dots appearing in sequence. I had been feeling a little nervous up to that point, and in a gesture of relief, I lowered my head slightly and sighed. It was there, just at a moment when I decided to devote genuine attention to something that I could not notice my tiredness, which had been presented for several weeks. If I was truly going to relax for a few hours, I wanted to feel like I was in peak condition, so I got up to head to the bathroom and wash my face. Before heading out the door, I turned to look at the monitor, which was still showing the same thing. That computer was low end, not to mention quite a few years old, and although I always tried to get the most out of it with good quality peripherals such as speakers, keyboards, and webcam, these had no impact on performance, and it was understandable that it was taking longer than usual. When I returned to the room, a couple meters away from the desk, I noticed that the screen was still not changing, so I figured there was nothing more to do. I made my way to the chair with the intention of turning everything off, but the very instant I sat down, the image changed to a background of a colorful 16-bit landscape, exactly the same as the original, which is the classic animation of Sonic waving his hand. Everything looked like an identical emulation, except for the text under the main logo, where it should have said Sega 1991. There were apparently the same unknown characters that had become typical since I connected the USB. With that, I managed to realize that it was some kind of ROM hack. With Enrique, we had tried some of these kinds of games, and even though none of the ones I remembered took as long as it did as this one, it could simply be due to a combination of factors including both hardware and softwares. And the ones I played in those days, the difference with the original versions were they were just minor, mostly small fixes that made the experience a little different, and even though I always preferred unmodified games, I pressed the enter button. The scene switched to the Green Hill Zone Act 1 title card to then begin afterward. I could control the character with the buttons on the keyboard, and despite not being an original ROM, everything looked identical to what I remember from the actual game. The muscle memory in my fingers got ahead of my thoughts, and before I knew it, the character was already running and jumping, finishing the level quickly and without any mistakes. What continued was a bonus stage where the platforms kept spinning constantly. At the same time, Sonic was rotating without stopping. In the background was a set of green birds perpetually moving to the right, and everything on screen was in motion. Those kinds of visual stimuli always seemed excessive to me, but I had never been dizzy from it in the past. On several occasions, I had to rub my eyes to try to rest my sight, and I even got to the point of gagging. Finishing it became an ordeal for me, especially since at the end, the totality of the visible objects started spinning even faster, causing me unbearable discomfort. I got up from the chair as the upbeat and triumph music of success played. I ran to the bathroom as I felt as I was about to vomit, and even though I didn't, I had to stay there breathing deeply for a few minutes until I recovered. The moment I returned and positioned myself in front of the desk again, similar to what happened before, just as I sat down, the scene changed. It had remained for the whole time I was in the bathroom on the white screen while the title, Chaos Emerald, but the instant I positioned myself in front of the computer, the sound of transition to the next level was heard, appearing for a fraction of a second, an object in the center. I was aware that this element in the original game was an emerald, but this time it was completely different. Although I could not distinguish what, the title card for Green Hill Zone Act 2 was being played when, despite the fact that the game seemed to have reacted to my presence twice already, and that I no longer consider it as a coincidence, my desire to continue increased. While I was absolutely certain that what I had in front of me was not normal, I could not stop. The more I continued to play, the more my body seemed to become obsessed with continuing, despite my performance doing nothing but diminishing. Years ago, I would pass the first few levels with no problem, but now it was becoming difficult, and when I suffered the first damage of the game, instead of the iconic yellow rings appearing, red square-shaped objects appeared. This could be due to two simple reasons: a simple programming error, or a deliberate action of whoever created the ROM. But having already had the previous experiences, the answer was clear. Even when I had managed to realize that all this was wrong, I could not find a way to stop, as if my fingers were moving on their own, treacherously disobeying my head. Every time the character suffered an impact with those reddened bodies constantly appearing, my desire to try again increased, and in the same way, so did my failures. At first, I attributed this to the fact that the version that came on the flash drive was simply more difficult, but I quickly realized that I was the only one responsible. After a few minutes, similar to what happened at the end of bonus stage, I was sure that something appeared on the screen for a brief moment, and although I was unable to recognize exactly what I saw, my brain did perceive it and was beginning to feel the consequences. Suddenly, I felt my eyes started to burn, my heartbeat accelerated, my hands became moist, and my breathing became difficult. The sound frequency emitted by my computer speakers were gradually fluctuating, but not because of the software, but because I was gradually losing consciousness of myself. My fingers were suddenly heavy as if they were made of solid iron, which caused my left index finger to land awkwardly on the accelerating button so the character ran until it got stuck on an obstacle. And as much as I was aware of that, my physical condition were not enough to react. My mind then was flooded with the most worst intrusive thoughts I had ever imagined. I remember Enrique. I imagined myself with him, both as children, and just as in my reoccurring dreams, we both had our faces flooded with tears, as I witnessed him violently punching himself in the face. As hard as I tried to stop him, my body would not respond, and I could only resign myself to screaming for him to stop. Despite my efforts, I only managed to observe my friend's face swelling vertigously with each impact of his fist, which at the moment he was terribly disfigured. Enrique proceeded to tear out strands of his hair along with screams of agony, although I knew that none of it was anything more than an illusion. The sensation of profound terror that those images produced in me were palpable. And just as my heart rate had intensified enough, I was slowly beginning to feel pain in my chest, and it was slowly beginning to spread to my shoulder. I regained my sense of reality, and I looked to the front where the monitor was located, which no longer displayed the game's level, but instead featured Sonic's head in the foreground at the center of the dark background, as if he were looking at me directly at me. His expression looked completely out of place for what I was used to from the character. Impassive, but as if he was communicating 1,000 words per second with his face alone. My vision blurred as time passed, and by the time I completely lost the detail in my gaze, seeing only a blue spot in the center of a black background, my hearing ceased. I could only hear a faint buzzing sound along with the desperate beating of my heartbeat, while I could only make out a blurry body on which two thin red flashes began to be drawn. My cheeks became wet. Tears escaped from my eyes, indicating that my body would still express a hint of emotion, and with that, I could regain my sight and hearing. The image had changed again. The blue hedgehog was still staring at me. At the same time, distorted and distant cries can be heard too. Like me, he was crying too, and along with the warmth in my cheek, I could imagine myself reflected in the screen. My thoughts were so jumbled that the slightest thought of any stimulus managed to wipe out all logic that would flow in my brain. I saw myself in him, and for some reason, I felt that he saw himself in me. Tears were flowing from our eyes, but his were not like mine. It was blood draining from him, and my mind interpreted it in such a way that it seemed I could stain myself with it. It looked thick and vicious, and I analyzed it closely, and I couldn't help but think that it could cause severe pain to the character as it drained in such a manner. What I was witnessing was in and of itself disturbing, but what really killed my sanity was a deep sense of sadness that gnawed at me every second that my eyes bore into his. For a moment, I thought that my life was already reached its climax and that I never wanted to understand my own existence again. From around the screen, I could recognize the word "Rest in Peace," RIP, written multiple times in a barely discernible gray color. I felt I could reason that the message I was being exposed to were intended to affect my judgment, but despite that, I was completely helpless to their effects. Suddenly, without a warning, a cut to black, like the snapping of a hypnotist's fingers. I finally regained some of my faculties. The deafening silence I was immersed in did not induce any direct physical discomfort as I know it was intended earlier. However, gaining consciousness and understanding what was happening to me was a catalyst for the first fang before the deepest sense of terror I had ever felt in my entire life. It was a new strobe light, a rapid flash as effective as a weapon of war, for which I suddenly failed to move a single muscle. It was not like in my dream, as I retained the clear knowledge that it was real life. There was no more confusion or lingering images. My mental clarity returned, but I lost all ability to use my body. Not my arms, not my legs, not my eyes, not even my eyelids. I was doomed to stand there perpetually staring at the screen, which at the moment seemed to be turned off. And so I was for a few seconds some of the longest I had ever felt. Then, without warning, at the same time that the burning in my eyes became unbearable because I was unable to blink, the number 10 appeared on the screen in red. At first, I could not understand what was happening, but as soon as it changed to 9, I quickly understood. It was a countdown, and by then, I could not be more aware that what I witnessed from the moment I plugged in the flash drive was beyond comprehension. In the minutes since I executed the file, I had already experienced the most extreme sensation of pain, fear, and sadness of my entire life. And I became convinced that once those numbers hit 0, it was going to be the end. In my mind, I said goodbye to my mom, who always supported me through everything, and it was a real shame to think that she would never have been able to see me through the situation. I thought about Enrique, and I even went over all the experiences we had since we met when we were both about 5 years old, and now apparently we were going to share the same ending. The countdown went to 6, and in my brain there was only resignation. Why did this have to happen? I was really willing to put myself out of my misery. I wanted to get better. I worked hard to get better. I was tired of being dead in life, completely exhausted from feeling nothing but self-pity, ready to continue my existence in peace. I did not wish to continue to harm my loved ones, who were trying so hard to measure their words in front of me and to take care of me. On the screen, the 4 was drawn. When my discernment was already mutated, my eyelids reacted in a quick blink. I was not going to let it all end like this. My fingers managed to contract at will. I would not die here. My head managed to turn impetuously to one side. My decision had already been made, and I no longer wanted to turn back. When the number on the monitor was 1, I jumped to the ground, not looking at all at whatever was displayed after the countdown ended. As my body hit the floor from the speaker, I heard the most dissonant and disturbing sound I had ever heard, as if it were coming from an unimaginable beast, so loud that it made my speakers crackle violently. Quickly, with all the strength I had left, I grabbed the power cord and unplugged it without even thinking about it. Suddenly, it was all over. I was so exhausted I lay there breathing weakly until I lost consciousness again. I woke up in the arms of my mom, who was looking at me with tear-filled eyes. My throat felt tight and my mouth went dry. I caressed her face lovingly for the first time in a long time. We cried together, but this time for joy. When we were both calm, I tried to explain to her what had happened as level-headedly as possible, since I had no interest in keeping anything from her any longer. And finally, as soon as I regained my basic energy, I went to the computer and disconnected the pen drive. We went out to the patio and left it inside a small grill that had not been lit for months. Wrapped it in paper, soaked it with kerosene. We used a match to light it and hugged each other as we watched the flames consume the entire contents. First came the sheets of newspaper, which slowly contracted in reaction to the heat and fan the fire, so that it was so intense enough to completely reach the flash drive. I could not have taken a hammer and smashed it or simply taken it apart or thrown the pieces into the trash, but no, I decided that it ends should be slow and quiet. I wanted to watch the plastic melt, to listen to the cackling of the transistors collapsing, to witness the moment when every particle of that object would separate and be lost in the wind forever. And a few moments before, I felt satisfied. I could see the colors of the flames turning intensely blue. The next day, I woke up feeling different, as if nothing could ever surprise me as much or make me feel worse than what I had already experienced. I understood that the worst was behind me, but there was something missing that still made me feel uneasy. I hadn't visited him until that moment, but unlike what I thought would happen, I felt deeply at peace. It was a sunny day, and it had been a long time since I had heard the subtle sounds of birds and the breeze whipping the autumn leaves. Enrique's memories were vivid, as if I were just another spectator witnessing a scene. Suddenly, I could see myself as a child playing with the ones who never stopped nor will ever stop being my best friend. It was an image that was constantly repeated in my dreams, but this time, something was different. It was the faces of both of them, which, for the first time, were showing enthusiastic and honest smiles, real smiles.